Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video. And in this video, I'm going to be starting a new series. I'm going to try to go from Earth to Mercury. Now, I have done this flight in the past. I did it back before I was ever recording Orbiter videos. Since then, I've learned quite a bit about Orbiter, and I think I can probably get to Mercury now in a slightly more fuel-efficient manner than I have done in the past. Going to Mercury is actually one of the more challenging planets to go to in the solar system. When you leave Earth and go out toward Mars, you're slowing down because the sun's wanting to pull you back in. Of course, when you leave Earth, the Earth's wanting to pull you back in initially, but then the sun wants to pull you back in. So as you go out toward Mars, you're slowing down. And obviously that holds true for Jupiter and all the outer planets as well. But when we go the other direction, when we want to come in toward the inner planets like Venus, we speed up quite a bit because we're lowering one side of our orbit, and that side of our orbit, getting in closer to the sun causes quite a bit of acceleration, and getting to Mercury is particularly difficult because by the time you arrive, you're traveling so fast that it just requires a tremendous amount of fuel, a tremendous amount of delta V to slow yourself down so that you can get into orbit around Mercury and land. One of the nice things about Mercury, though, is that it is a solid body, unlike Venus, which is, Venus obviously has a solid surface, but it's a big, cloudy, thick, very thick, dense atmosphere. It's not real practical to land on it. But we can actually land on Mercury. So without any more jabber, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, I do want to say that I'm going to basically, I haven't sat down and written a script or sat down and prepared a bunch of scenario files or anything like that. So I'm going to be doing this completely live, in a sense. Obviously, this is a recorded video, but I don't have anything prepared ahead of time. I'm just going to go forward. So everything that you see in this video is exactly what I'm experiencing. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, my first thought is that I'm going to do a launch from Earth somewhat similar to the launch that I did when I went to Venus. Instead of having the XR-2 on the runway, instead of having the XR-2 on the runway and taking off, in the Venus video, I put the XR-2 on top of the Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy. I didn't really like doing that because it just doesn't look that good, but it was practical and it was somewhat realistic in the sense that the Falcon Heavy is capable of lifting that much mass into low Earth orbit. There's a better launcher, though, that has been released since I did that Venus flight, so I'm going to use that launcher instead. Now, for starters, I'm actually going to load one of the Orbiter default scenarios to create a scenario that I want to use. I'm going to go into the Space Shuttle Atlantis folder, and I'm just going to use Atlantis, launch into Sunrise. So go ahead and click that. And the reason I'm using this scenario is because I want to put a launcher on the same launch pad that Atlantis will be sitting on, because again, this is going to be a vertical launch and not a runway launch, and we're not going to be using the SpaceX stuff, so I can't use that launcher. So by default, this is what launch into Sunrise looks like. It's pretty generic. So I'm going to press Control F4 to bring up the scenario editor. And I can probably start by just deleting some stuff we don't need. We don't need the Luna wheel in this scenario. We don't need mirror. We don't really even need the ISS, but it doesn't hurt to leave it there. We don't need the Shuttle A. So I'm just doing a little bit of housekeeping, cleaning up stuff that we are not going to use in the scenario. Now I'm going to go to New, and I'm going to put in the, can't remember the name of it. It's HCLV. So we'll call it just HCLV-01. And what I want is this one here, the HCLV-S XR2. Now this is the launcher that it's a fairly new launcher. It came out like I think it might have even came out while I was in the hospital getting my lung transplant, but it was somewhere during that time, because after I got out I found out that it had been released, and I was really excited because I've been looking forward to this launcher for a long time. So I'll click that and hit create, and that will put it in orbit. So now I'm going to select location, because obviously I don't want it in orbit, and I'm going to copy state from STS 101, and that's so now we have the HCLV sitting here, and it's actually sitting like overlaying Space Shuttle Atlantis. They're kind of, overlapping each other. So now I'm going to go back to this scenario editor and delete some of this other stuff we don't need anymore. I don't need Carina. That's a satellite that's inside the cargo bay area. I'm going to delete that. And then now I can delete Space Shuttle Atlantis. So that's a pretty good way to get the HCLV here in the proper position without having to, do a bunch of coordinate moving by putting it in place, by copying the state of Atlantis. It puts it right here where I want. Now, let me set this aside. Actually, I was going to close it for now. Now, we can see, obviously, there's a problem with the launcher sitting on the ground and not up here. But fortunately, this launcher is really great. Has a lot of options that you can choose. So I'm going to press Control Spacebar. And let me do that again. Control Spacebar. Why is that going away? Okay. Why is that disappearing as soon as I hit it? Oh, there we go. So Control Spacebar brings up this configuration, and this lets you adjust the up-down, basically. Right now we can see that it's got an offset of 10. That's clearly not enough. So let's try 20. Well, let me just do it this way. So 20 offset, well, 21. That's still not enough. Let's try 25. And as we can kind of zoom in here, we can see now that the boosters are basically sitting right on the pad. So if you want to have it maybe be a little bit higher, you might want to go 26 or 27. But then you've got this issue where now the whole system seems to be floating in place. Obviously, this launcher is not made for this platform, so it's not going to look the best. If you want it to look the best, you're going to want to use the launcher on the Carl Sagan Space Complex, I think it's called. But I don't really want to do that, so I'm going to just have it look a little shoddy. So that's how I can adjust the HCLV as far as its up-down position. So I'm done with that. Now I need to have an XR-2, because obviously there's nothing attached to this vessel yet. So now I'm going to do a Control F4, go back to the scenario editor, new XR-2-01, and this part's pretty standard. Scroll down the list, find the XR-2, hit create, and that will put it in orbit. So here's something that we can do though. We go to done, and we select the HCLV and go to the editor. And this is something that the HCLV has that other vessels don't have, like the Falcon Heavy, Falcon 9 rockets don't have this payload manager. This payload manager makes life really easy. If you did see that Venus video that I did, you saw then that I did a 1-hour explanation just to explain how to attach the XR-2 to the Falcon Heavy. I mean, the process is pretty ridiculous. This is so much easier. Just go to the payload manager, and we select which vessel we're going to attach to it. Just from the drop down, obviously we want the XR-2. Now you can see it's attached, but it's kind of in this really weird angle. So, but this editor makes it really simple to edit. What we have to do is just change the axes and coordinates here. So we want that to be 0. And I believe the z-axis is 0. Let's actually start by zeroing out everything. Okay, so that gets the XR2 laying sort of that way. So I think the Z-axis might be the one that has to be negative that way. Yeah, so it's basically, you basically need to flip around the Z-axis in order to get the XR2 to appear as though it's mounted onto the side. And that's basically it, although you can also, the Y coordinate can be adjusted, and that will, the Y coordinate is how close to the HCLV the XR2 will appear. So for example, if we have it, 6, then obviously that's not correct. And then if it's 4, there you can see it's kind of inside, almost inside of the thing, so it doesn't look quite right. The number that I remember reading in the manual, I believe, was 5.1, was what they determined was the perfect. With a 5.1 Y coordinate here, it's supposed to appear as though the XR2 is sitting where it's supposed to sit and is mounted on these, whatever you call them, these holders, these mount points, these joints. So that's going to be that. Go ahead and hit done there, close. And that's going to be, that scenario is basically ready. So I'm going to go ahead and Control S to save it so that I save the work that I've done so far. Now it's time to find out what date I'm going to use for going to Mercury. So let me press F1 so I can get inside of one of these vessels. It probably makes the most sense to be inside of the HCLV for starters. Now, I actually, I also want to say before I go too much further that I have Dimitri to thank for helping me learn a lot more about making a more efficient trip to Mercury. I knew that my previous trips weren't very efficient, but I really didn't know a whole lot about what I could really do about it. But Dimitri, this whole year, I mean, this guy is just absolutely amazing. I mean, you hear me talk about him all the time, and I just can't even say enough nice things about the guy. He's just absolutely incredible. But I'm going to kind of go from memory here. I believe what we have to do is reference the sun. And then we need to target... Actually, I don't think that's right. Let me check my notes here. Just bear with me for a moment. Again, this video is going to be a little bit different from some of my past videos where, I just kind of go through things from beginning to end. And a lot of it's because I've done those other flights so many times, or there's just not that much that's different about them that I can figure things out kind of on the fly. But it's been long enough since I've messed with going to Mercury that I'm going to have to refer back to some of my notes here. Basically, the point here that we need to determine is we need to determine when we can leave Earth, and we want to leave Earth when Mercury is at one of the nodes, because well, let me first of all refer back to my note here, and then I'll explain what I can as I go. Actually, let me just read what I wrote in my notes. It says basically, you need to leave Earth when Earth is just crossing the descending node of Mercury. You can know this by bringing up orbit MFD, referencing the sun, and then choosing Mercury as the target. Okay, so I was on the right track over here. So now we need to target Mercury. Okay. And note that you need to be landed on Earth when looking at orbit MFD for this purpose. So for example, if you were trying to do this, if you were already in orbit, it wouldn't work out very well. It doesn't matter where you are on Earth, but you won't get the information you need if you're in orbit around Earth. When Earth crosses the line of nodes, the one pointing at the empty square box, then Earth is at Mercury's descending node. Okay. So this is Earth. Yeah. So the sun's in the middle. This is the orbit of Mercury around the sun. This is where the Mercury is at in its orbit around the sun, and this is where we are at in our orbit around the sun. So what we need to have happen, this is all starting to come back to me now. What we need to have happen is we need to have Earth at this position. So we need to have Earth at Mercury's the descending node. And I even remember the reason for it. And I'll just read what I wrote here previously. I say in my notes, I put why the descending node. Is the ascending node just as good? And no. Leaving at the ascending node is not as good, and here's why. Mercury's orbit around the sun is quite elliptical. At its apoapsis, it is 69.12 gigameters from the sun. At its periapsis, Mercury is 45.3 gigameters from the sun. In the somewhat counterintuitive world of orbital physics, it turns out that it's actually better to show up at Mercury when Mercury is near its periapsis. It would probably seem more logical to think that we should arrive at Mercury's apoapsis, since things travel slower when they are at their farthest point. That's exactly what I thought when I was initially setting this up. And I was actually, in talking to Dimitri, he told me he thought the same thing early on, and when he was trying to figure out how to get to Mercury efficiently as well. But the reason that it doesn't work that way is because of relative velocity. When we arrive at Mercury, our vessel will be traveling really fast. So if we arrive at Mercury when Mercury is traveling slowly, then our difference in velocity will be higher than it would be if we were to arrive at Mercury's periapsis. So it turns out that it's better to arrive at Mercury. We leave the Earth here, fall in toward the sun, and we want to arrive at Mercury closer to the ascending node, so that we're at its periapsis. That way, Mercury is traveling faster around the sun at that point, and because our velocity will be so high, then our difference in velocity between our vessel and Mercury will be lower. Now, I also remember that it works out that in May of every year, Earth is at Mercury's descending node. And since we need to go forward by more than just a few days, it's much easier to use the scenario editor. So we'll go to the scenario editor, bring up the date editor, and we're going to bump the clock forward by a month. See, now we're in April. Going to go forward another month. Now we're in May, and you can see here in May of the year, we're really close to Mercury's descending node. So now we need to back off a few days. So we'll back up the clock 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5, 6, 7, and there we are. We are now right at Mercury's descending node. Now it becomes a question of timing. We need to arrive, or whether we need to leave Earth, so that by the time we fall in toward the sun, Mercury will have had time to go from wherever it is at in its present position to its ascending node. And I know just from previous experience that this is not the right position. If we were to leave the Earth here, we would arrive at Mercury here, and Mercury would be like, out here or something. It would be really far away. We wouldn't even be, it'd be on the other side of the, it'd be on the other side of the sun. So what we can do at this point is we can just fast forward time 1 year at a time, because we know that Earth will always be at Mercury's descending node in May around this time of the year. So instead of bumping the time forward by months and days, now I'm just going to use the year. Go forward 1 year, and I know just from experience that that's still not close enough. So in 2002, this trip still would not work. So go forward again, and again, I know from experience that's not close enough. If we were to do the trip here, it wouldn't work. So go forward another year, and again, we're getting closer, but we're not quite at the point where Mercury's close enough to its own ascending node. So this time still would not work. Go forward another year. It's getting pretty close, but I believe that's still not close enough. It's getting very close, though. That might be too close. Sometimes you have this problem where from this point to this point, you've missed the opportunity and you have to go around another 7 years. It turns out that you have a good opportunity to go to Mercury about once every 7 years. Sometimes there's a couple of consecutive years in a row, oddly, where from 1 year to the next you can make the trip, but then you can't make another trip for 7 years. Now, the only way to really know, to be able to figure this out, is to start dialing it in with transx. So let me check the time on the video here. We're at 20 minutes, so I'll go ahead and start that process and see if this date will work. So bring up TransX on this side, bring up TransX on this side, and we will target escape, go forward, and we want Mercury on this side. We'll go forward, create the stage 3, view the encounter, and now we can just kind of come back to stage 2 on that side. Stage 2 on this side, rather. So now we're going to view the eject plan, and we're going to put in a bunch of negative prograde to bring our orbit way down to the orbit of Mercury. And we'll kind of start with that as our ballpark figure. Kind of working it down a little bit more. Now, this gets in, dialing in Mercury is one of the most frustrating things to do, was one of the most frustrating planets as far as TransX is concerned. It's the timing is so sensitive that just a few hours on one side or the other, let alone days or weeks, it can really throw things off drastically. So we're set. Let's actually, yeah, we're set for now. That's fine for the time being. I'll see what kind of plane change adjustments we can make. And it won't always improve. You know, sometimes you have to make things worse before you make them better. With, especially when getting to Mercury. So we're getting reasonably close. You know, 400, what is that, 400,000 kilometers. So now I'm just going to go through some of these other variables. Okay, that's bringing it down, but we overshot. Let's go with that for now. Let's try some more prograde. Yeah, you can see just now I'm at this point where slight adjustments are making big differences, but it's not quite close enough, and it gets really tricky to get in, to dial in that last little bit. We have to start working with date. Okay, that's not helping. Let's go back. That's making it worse. So right somewhere around here for now, we'll say. Okay, so adding in outward. Okay, go with that. Okay, let me try this again. Let's get to the low point. That's 400. We had better than that a moment ago. Okay, so let's go negative on the outward. Okay, positive on the plane change, and then that makes it even lower, so we'll go further into the positive. Now go back to outward. And you see I'm kind of overshooting the variables one way or the other. So now, okay, so here I saw the low point was about 121, but I'm going to continue to put in some negative. And now I'm going to go back to a plane change and put in some more positive, and you can see that ultimately it brings it down. So that's one of the things that's kind of difficult to understand about TransX, is that you're kind of in this mindset that you're always trying to dial in the lowest number, and that's true. But sometimes to get to that lowest number, you have to overshoot in one direction and then come back with a different variable. And by coming back with the other variable, it actually drives down the number overall. And before you understand that, you'll never get the lowest point, because you're fighting two different variables that are opposing each other. Okay, so now I'm just going to continue to bring this down. This is obviously still very high. We need to get way lower than this. So back to outward. And was it negative outward that was helping, or positive outward? think it was negative outward. So I'm going to go negative on the outward. Bring it, I'm overshooting again in this direction. Now I'll go back to plane change. And you see how that works. Now it's coming down even more. Now I'm going to overshoot the plane change in this direction. Go out to say 50. Now go back to outward. And come back this way, and I'll overshoot the outward in the other direction. This is one of the nicer things about IMFD. You don't have to figure this stuff out. It figures it out for you. Now back to plane change, and again, I'm just going to overshoot. So now we're down to 15 as our low point. So I'll overshoot out to say 50 or something like that again. Now back to outward, come back. And it should be much lower, or it should be a little bit lower than 15 this time. Now we're down to 8, 7, 6. So now I'm going to overshoot this way. Back to plane change. Now we're down to 3.5, so we're getting pretty close. Let's overshoot to 15. Back to outward. And there we have it. We are there. Okay, now let's go back to plane change and let's just fine tune this in all the way down to the surface. Okay, back to plane change. That's getting really sensitive now, so I want to be careful with that one. Outward. Yep, there we go. We're all the way to the surface. So let's back it up just a touch. And there we go. And this isn't looking too bad, actually. Our PE velocity is 10,000, about 11 kilometers per second, basically, with the capture delta V of 6.7. I'll have to compare my notes to see exactly how good or bad this is. Off the top of my head, I can't actually remember. So let me actually check real quick. Close that out. I have a whole spreadsheet that I started making back in like March or April of this year. Because I was actually planning this trip all the way back then. I started thinking about it back then. Where's it at? Calculators, I think. But I never got around to doing the trip back then, and then obviously the long hospital stuff. So let's see here. Compared to what I came up with here in the spreadsheet that I made, PE velocity is what I'm interested in. So a good PE velocity would be lower than this, would be quite a bit lower than that actually. So this actually isn't that great. So what I'm looking at here is a spreadsheet that I made where I went through TransX, and I probably spent, I don't know, I'm not even joking when I say I probably spent 10 hours playing around with TransX to find some different dates. And what I came up with back then was the best PE velocity, which would be, here, was 9,000, or basically 9 kilometers per second. So if I want to beat this number, I'm going to have to play around with TransX quite a bit more. And what I can do is maybe bump the date forward a little bit. So instead of having it on this date, I can go forward by 1 day. So let's give that a shot and see what happens. But let me first quick save. So instead of 53863, let's say, what if we left 1 day later, 53864, and then some change. But you can see in just 1 day how much everything changes. It's huge. But we should be in the ballpark on this date. So let's do an adjustment here. Just watching the closest approach over here at the moment. Do an adjustment, back up. About right there is the low point. So now go to outward. And plane change. Okay, now we get to do this whole thing again. Okay, add in some additional plane change. Back to outward, take away some outward. Overshoot, plane change. Overshoot. I can already tell it's not going to be any better because the PE velocity is already 10.51. So by the time I get lower, it certainly isn't going to improve. So I don't have to do this anymore. Let's go. Let's try the date in the other direction. So instead of 53863, which is what it was before, let's try 2. So we'll say somewhere in the middle of the day there. And let's start with let me reset that variable. Okay, I need to add in some prograde because I'm a little low. I should say, take away some of the prograde that I added before. Okay, well, I'm coming up on 31 minutes here, and I'm really trying to keep my videos under around 30 minutes these days, just so they're not quite so long. So I'll go ahead and just stop right here, but I'm gonna keep recording. It'll be a new part. If you like this video, if you like the idea of going out to Mercury, please hit the like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Check out my Facebook page where I post all my videos, various photos, and other space-related content. The link to that Facebook page is in the description down below, and I'll see you in the next part. Is that I'm going to do a launch from Earth, somewhat similar to the launch that I did when I went to Venus. Instead of having the XR-2 on the runway, instead of having the XR-2 on the runway and taking off. In the Venus video, I put the XR-2 on top of the Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy. I didn't really like doing that because it just doesn't look that good, but it was practical and it was somewhat realistic in the sense that the Falcon Heavy is capable of lifting that much mass into low Earth orbit. There's a better launcher though that has been released since I did that Venus flight, so I'm going to use that launcher instead. To go ahead and get started. Now I do want to say that I'm going to basically I haven't sat down and written a script or sat down and prepared a bunch of scenario files or anything like that. So I'm going to be doing this completely live in a sense. Obviously this is a recorded video, but I don't have anything prepared ahead of time. I'm just going to go forward. So everything that you see in this video is exactly what I'm experiencing. So let's go ahead and get started. Now my first thought is Mars, you're slowing down because the sun, the sun's wanting to pull you back in. Of course, when you leave Earth, the Earth's wanting to pull you back in initially, but then the sun wants to pull you back in. So as you go out toward Mars, you're slowing down. And obviously that holds true for Jupiter and all the outer planets as well. But when we go the other direction, when we want to come in toward the inner planets like Venus, we speed up quite a bit because we're lowering one side of our orbit, and that side of our orbit, getting in closer to the sun causes quite a bit of acceleration, and getting to Mercury is particularly difficult because by the time you arrive, you're traveling so fast that it just requires a tremendous amount of fuel, a tremendous amount of delta V to slow yourself down so that you can get into orbit around Mercury and land. One of the nice things about Mercury, though, is that it is a solid body, unlike Venus, which is, well, Venus obviously has a solid surface, but it's a big, cloudy, thick, very thick, dense atmosphere. It's not real practical to land on it. But we can actually land on Mercury. So without any more jabber, Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video. And in this video, I'm going to be starting a new series I'm going to try to go from Earth to Mercury. Now, I have done this flight in the past. I did it back before I was ever recording Orbiter videos. Since then, I've learned quite a bit about Orbiter, and I think I can probably get to Mercury now in a slightly more fuel-efficient manner than I have done in the past. Going to Mercury is actually one of the more challenging planets to go to in the solar system. When you leave Earth and go out toward Mars,